Hi, welcome. So this is week one, first hour video, where we will be talking about a gentle introduction to AI, Gen AI, and LLM. Yeah. So in this, we will essentially cover a few things, essentially about what is AI, what is Gen AI, what is large language model, and what is the difference between Gen AI and large language models, why this field is so exciting, and then we will do some hands-on with public interfaces like ChatGPT or Grok or Gemini type of interface. Yeah. So let's start with first, what exactly is AI and Gen AI, yeah? Or in fact, what is AI? Yeah. So if I bring the notes here, oops. Yeah, so if I bring the notes here, it talks about artificial intelligence. AI is a broad field in computer science. So it's a field of computer science, and computer science is a field of science. So computer science essentially being a field of science, it deals with computers in general. So a computer science deals with, say, robotics, it deals with computer vision, it deals with NLP, natural language processing, etc. Yeah, so various fields. One broader field of computer science is this artificial intelligence. Yeah. Um, and what is the purpose of this particular field of computer science? It is essentially about making machines perform certain tasks that typically require human intelligence. Yeah. When we say typically require human intelligence, it could be about making certain decisions based on our past learning, right? That kind of thing. For example, if I take a simple example of a kid, right? Um, Initially, kid may not be aware of how to cross the road. Yeah, but then if you train the kid how to cross the road, essentially after a few iterations, possible that kid figures out a pattern. Like for example, before crossing the road, make sure that there are no traffic. Yeah. So once that pattern is built, then the kid is able to manage crossing the road. So that kind of identifying a pattern, making a decision, when to do, what to do type of thing. If we are able to make essentially machines do this, then that's the artificial intelligence. Yeah. So the gentle difference between robotics and artificial intelligence is robotics is where we try to make machines act physically like human. Yeah. Whereas in AI, it is more about making the mind part of human, which is essentially how to simulate the mind of a human for machines. So that's about the artificial intelligence piece. Yeah. So it talks about it's a field of computer science where machines are designed to perform tasks that typically require human intelligence. Yeah, this includes things like recognition of patterns, making decisions, solving problems, or understanding the languages. Yeah, so essentially, AI is a very broad field. It talks about how to simulate human mind. Yeah. Now, a subfield of AI is generative AI. Yeah, as the name indicates, generative AI is a subfield of AI systems that can essentially generate the content, the new content. Yeah. Um, so most of the time, we may have certain AI algorithms, for example, a classification algorithm, which essentially looks at how to classify the things based on the training. For example, if we train a model to classify between cat and dog, and if you show the picture of a dog, it can put that picture into a dog classification. Yeah, so that's kind of like a classifying algorithm. Yeah, but these generative AI models are essentially not just about classification or recognizing pattern, but it is more about generating the new content. The new content could be text, it could be image, it could be video, it could be even audio. Yeah, multimodal content. Yeah, so generative AI is a definitely a sub part of AI, as a division of AI, which can generate new content from scratch. When we say from scratch, based on the training that it got, for example, I may have a generative AI model which is trained on a very large textual data. Then it can identify the patterns, it can remember their training content, and then essentially when I ask or when I prompt the model to generate something new, it has an ability to generate new content. Yeah. So for example, if you give the AI prompt like write a story about a dragon, yeah, then it can actually write a new content from its past training. Yeah, that is what we call it as generative AI. So it can produce something which is original, which is never part of its training. Um, but then based on its training, it can do that particular thing. Yeah, so that's why we call it as a generative AI. Yeah, it doesn't copy the content, it generates the content. Yeah, it can actually create new ideas. It can actually behave literally like human in creating the new content. But there is a strong difference between a human and generative AI. um, that strong difference we will talk about in the future videos, but just as a hint, um, it is not a truly creative content. When GenAI creates something, it's not 100% truly creative content. Rather, it's more about generating based on its interpretation of the previous training material. Yeah, but in case of human, it's possible that human can actually generate completely, absolutely new content without any past training. Yeah, so that's the difference between a generative AI and human. Yeah, but most of the time, because of the sheer volume of the training data used, whatever the content a Gen AI generates is going to be original. It's going to be very precise based on our requirements. Yeah, so that's about Gen AI. Yeah. Now, before getting into LLM, so it's a how part. How exactly a Gen AI can actually do this? Like how can it creates an original content? Yeah, so it's based on the massive amount of data that is used for training such models. So that's why these generative AI are sometimes we call it as foundational models. For example, we have OpenAI model, we have Claude from Anthropic, we have Gemini from Google. So these foundation models, right, they require massive amount of training, amount of data to train, and amount of computational power, like we call it as GPU. Yeah. So this infrastructure is massive. And when we say it is massive, it requires billions of investment, right? So that's where exactly huge organizations create these foundational model. And then people like us, the startups, or maybe smaller organization, can leverage these foundation models and actually make them little more intelligent on their own content. So we will talk about that in the future courses. But in this case, it is because of the training that these models get, the massive amount of training data, they are able to actually figure out patterns. And from those patterns, they can actually start generating by playing with, for example, in LLM case, it just plays with the word and then generates the new content. So that's how these things generally work. Yeah. We will actually see in the real world example how this is actually happening. Yeah. Now, some examples of these generative AI models are foundational models, which I'm pretty sure you might have already interacted. If it is text generation, we have tools like ChatGPT, we have Grok, we have Gemini, etc. Right? And if you look at the image generation, because these are multimodal, it's not just limited to text. They are even going beyond text, image, video, speech, etc. Right? So if it is image generation, we had DALL-E, Midjourney, and then now we have Google Banana model. So those are available. You explain what you need using text, what we call it as prompt, and then they can actually generate the image out of it. Yeah. Now we also have music, video creation tools, and more importantly, we also have these code generation tools, or Copilot, what we call it as, or vibe coding, right? So these are going to be heavily used nowadays, are the best examples of Gen AI. Yeah. So that's about AI and Gen AI. Yeah. Now, what are these large language models? Yeah, and how they are actually different from essentially the Gen AI piece. Yeah. So what is a large language model? Yeah. Again, as we discussed in the previous section, AI is a subfield of computer science, and Gen AI is a subfield of essentially AI. Now, these large language models are again subfield of generative AI, which is essentially around language. Yeah, so these are huge computer programs or models, what we call it as. Models are different from our classical programs like, for example, earlier we used to write procedural or object-oriented programs, right? These models are slightly different. I will explain it in another video. But these are essentially, you can imagine, huge trained computer programs. And the training is on enormous amount of data sets. Just imagine billions of text. Or in simple words, just as an example, these models might have been trained on literally every textbook available on internet. Yeah, so that kind of thing. And these are trained not just in one language like English. These are trained in different languages, including regional languages. For example, in India, it could be Hindi, the regional languages of India, etc. Right? These are trained literally on every data available on internet. That's why the large part of it comes into picture. Yeah, but then LLMs are very specific to the language piece of it. So the language, essentially the language has more of uh, the pieces. Like for example, different languages have different grammar, right? For example, our regional languages vary a lot as compared to English. So training them on these languages is very different from training a model in some statistical or mathematical formula. Yeah, so that's why these LLMs are a very broad set of Gen AI where they're specifically trained on languages. They can understand the language grammar. They can understand the difference between an English and an Hindi language. Yeah, so that's exactly these models are. And most of the time, when they are trained on a specific language, right, they create something called parameters, which essentially act like a model's brain. And these parameters are such huge parameters generated. For example, if you go to any Gen AI LLM model, they talk about this is 70 billion parameter model. So what it means is the amount of language parameter uh, which essentially this particular model is trained is around 70 billion parameter. So that you can imagine how much the training went in these particular models. Yeah. So these are LLMs. So essentially these are generative AI. It's a subfield of generative AI, but largely trained on the languages. So they can recognize words, they can translate from one language to another language. They can literally do anything related to language. So that's the LLM piece of it, are large language models. Yeah. Now, how do they actually work? Yeah. So if you look at most of these LLMs, or in fact, all of these NLMs have few things. One is the training, right? This is the vast amount of data, the text data, which is they have been trained on. And these are essentially on different languages, different context, etc. Yeah, because of the training, they have generated a pattern and they can actually deal with any languages very easily. Yeah, that's one thing. Yeah. Second thing is the architecture on which they have been built. And there is one fundamental part of that architecture called transformer. Yeah, that transformer essentially is a type of neural network. Now, what is neural network, etc., we will discuss separately, but you can imagine it's kind of like a brain cell. Yeah, which essentially helps these LLMs to understand the context of the language or a sentence. For example, if I say, hey, myself is Guru, for example, yeah, then this transformer actually help the language models to understand the context. It understands that, yes, somebody is talking about or somebody is giving a self introduction. Yeah, and his name is Guru. So that's how these can essentially understand the context. Yeah, they can understand the grammar. Yeah, and very importantly, because of something called embedding, they can actually correlate or put the related words in some sort of category. For example, the moment when they are being trained, whenever during the training, if they encounter word dog, um, and then the dog word has been used in sentences like dog is a pet, and X has a dog, and somebody loves dog. So the moment it encounters these kind of sentences, possible that the LLM will figure out, oh, dog seems to be an animal, a pet animal. Yeah. And then similarly, whenever it encounters other sentences where we talk about cat, then it might figure out, yes, cat also seems to be a pet animal. Now, because of the architecture, these LLMs will try to put dog and cat somewhat in a similar space you can imagine, so that whenever we talk about pet, it should be able to visualize dog and cat easily. Yeah, so that's how these architecture are transformer, coding, decoding, encoding, and embedding, and these kind of different technologies, approaches that are used. They will help the large language models to actually learn the language, understand the grammar, understand the context, as well as understand certain nuances. Like some languages may interpret a language in a negative way, so the language should be able to, or LLM should be able to understand this kind of thing. Yeah. um, on top of that, there is something called fine tuning. Yeah. Fine tuning is after an LLM is being trained generally on a language. The fine tuning part is more about training the languages or large language models to a specific domain. For example, I might want to use OpenAI is one of the model to fine tune it on healthcare, for example, so that now on top of the general language related training that it has received, now it will receive more about healthcare. And then it becomes a large language model which is specific to healthcare domain. And it can understand healthcare context. It can understand and it can start predicting certain things which are healthcare related. So that's what we call it as fine tuning. Yeah. Then comes the inference part of it. So once that these models are trained, fine-tuned, and they also have something called feedback. They constantly keep learning based on how we interact with them. But then once these things happen, then people will start interact with them, and then these large language models will start understanding the user's questions, or in AI terms we call it as prompts, and then based on the prompts they can start generating new stuff, which is what we call it as inference. Yeah, when you ask a question, LLM generates a response by chaining the predictions together word by word. Yeah, so essentially in a very fundamental way, LLMs are nothing but these are text predictors. Yeah, they essentially are trained and tuned in such a way with such a vast amount of volume, they can predict every word and they can connect and then start generating the meaningful output by predicting every word by word. So that's how these large language models generally work. Yeah, so that's about how these work. And some examples, if you take, we had these OpenAI, OpenAI releasing various models, GPT series. Chat GPT is one such LLM. Gemini from Google, Llama from Meta, Claude from Anthropic, Grok from X. So these are all such examples of LLMs. Yeah, we'll be interacting with most of these things. Yeah. Now that's about the LLM. So in essence, LLM is another specialized subcategory of Gen AI, and Gen AI in terms is a subcategory of AI. Yeah. So LLMs are essentially for large language related stuff. So whenever you think about text generation, music, image generation, etc., right, you should be thinking about large language models. Yeah. So that's about LLM. Yeah. So in the next video, we'll talk about what is the actual difference between a Gen AI and LLM and why this field is so exciting. And then we will get into more of an hands-on with LLM. Yeah, see you there.